Okay, the next painting that we're going to do is going to be a landscape where we draw these trees and then paint them in value. So you can see that there's very, very light value and then kind of a middle tone and then the darkest all the way in the foreground. And this is just to get some practice on mixing the colors and creating different tones, tints and tones to create this value. And so I'm going to start, this is going to be on paper. I'm going to start by drawing them out very, very lightly in pencil. And for that first row, it's just slightly, again, the paper is in landscape, and just slightly higher than, say, the halfway point. So I'm just going to draw kind of a very light line there in the middle part, just slightly higher than middle. And then about an inch down, I'm going to draw another sort of wavy line. Again, don't use a ruler for this because it's nature. It wouldn't be a perfectly straight line anyway. And then about another inch or so, and then another sort of wavy line. So we have these three, one kind of toward the center, and then a second one, and then a third. I'm going to start here at the first one, the very farthest, the trees that are farthest away from us in the background, and just kind of lightly draw out just sort of lightly draw out the trees and the branches. This branch comes up here. This one go like that. There we go. And you can see that they're going off of the paper on the top. So very, very lightly, I'm just drawing out these trees. They can kind of overlap in certain areas. Notice that the trunks obviously are bigger, and then it goes into the branches. And you can go back in and add a few branches. Maybe you've got one where the branches don't start till toward the top. Kind of vary them a bit. This one branches way out. Okay, so I'm drawing them out very lightly. You can see where the trunks meet that line. I'm just going to erase that piece of the line there. Okay. Now, go ahead and get your paint. This one's going to be just in black and white. So black and white, I'm going to add a little bit of color, just a tiny bit of the blue, kind of give the whole thing a bluish tint for this painting. You may want to do yours in an ochre, or you might just want to do it in gray tones with the black and white, okay? So I'll leave that up to you, whether you do it with just the gray or add just a tiny, tiny bit of color. Now, one thing about when you're getting color with the acrylic paints, make sure you sort of measure. If your puddle of paint is any bigger than a quarter, then you're probably getting too much, all right? So if the pump is not working on the bottles, please let me know so I can change the pumps out. So we're not pouring the paint out, because we've been actually throwing away quite a lot of paint. So you can see that with the white, I've got a little bit more than I really needed that was left out from earlier. But again, if it's any bigger than a quarter, try and keep it about that size of paint, okay? And for this first, the one that's farthest away in the background, that's going to be our lightest color here. And so you can see that when I mix the paint, always mix the paint. You should never use the paint right out of the tube. Never use the color right out of the tube. You should be mixing colors. You'll see that I'm going to start with the white. So it's going to be mostly white in the background. And then I'm going to take just a tiny, tiny drop. Notice it's a tiny drop on the brush. And I'm going to mix that into the white to make a very light gray tone. And actually, I'm going to give this just a little bit of blue. Again, tiny, tiny bit. It only takes a small amount to turn this into a bluish tint. I'm going more so for the gray rather than a light blue here, but just a slight blue. All right, and so then I'm going to just go in and just paint that very light blue and sort of light grayish, bluish gray color into that whole, all the way down to that line. Now notice I haven't drawn the other trees yet. I'm gonna paint this and let that dry before I draw in the other trees. So the trunks are bigger. Notice I'm going with the, say, pattern of the texture of the shape. So when I'm painting in the ground area, all of my brush strokes are going this way, are going horizontal because it's the ground. When I'm going painting in the tree, I'm sort of following the curves of the branches. But I'm keeping this pretty much a solid color. Very light tint of gray. Now notice I've got varying brushes as well, and so that I can get some of those thinner branches. Now another thing you might want to do is to get a palette knife and to mix your color, mix a puddle of the gray so that you're not having to constantly match it up again. Because you see, as I just did that, I actually changed the color of gray just a little bit, just slightly. Which that's okay too, as long as it's close in tint when you're making it. And so I'm going to go through, I'm going to paint that entire thing. Now, like I was saying, another thing you can do is you can take your palette knife like this, and I can scoop up some of the white, like that, and then add just a tiny, tiny bit of black, tiny bit. Because remember, you can always add more to tint it more. You can see that's a bit darker, so I'm going to go more of the white. Probably going to use that whole thing. There we go, that's close. And then that way I already have some pre-mixed. I got some yellow in there, so I'll have to watch that. I'm going to end up turning this a little bit greenish, but it's all right. As long as I'm still in the same sort of value scale. And again, I'm using very little pressure. I'm going to paint in that whole area here, all the way down to that line. Okay, so that is, and I'm going to fill in this entire area, this entire section with that shade. So that is the first step, step number one for our painting trees in value.